The Intersystem Combat Academy existed in a state of carefully maintained contradiction. On one hand, it advertised itself as the premier institution for training the galaxy's finest warriors, peacekeepers, and tactical operatives. On the other hand, roughly 60% of its curriculum focused on teaching species not to accidentally kill each other during lunch breaks. This was the inevitable result of cramming 200 cadets from 47 different worlds into a rotating habitat station and expecting them to play nice. Station Meridian 7 orbited a gas giant in neutral space, which was diplomatic speak for nobody wanted this useless chunk of territory enough to fight over it. The station itself was a masterwork of engineering, assuming your definition of masterwork included sterile corridors that all looked identical and artificial gravity that occasionally decided to take coffee breaks. It housed training facilities that could simulate everything from zero-G combat to fighting in methane atmospheres, though the latter was mainly used by the 4 cadets who actually breathed methane and everyone else who wanted to experience what drowning in reverse felt like. The Academy's reputation preceded it like a particularly aggressive herald. Graduate from Meridian 7, and you could write your own ticket anywhere in the known galaxy. Fail out, and well, there were always mining colonies in need of security personnel who didn't ask questions about your past. The instructors were former special operatives, decorated veterans, and in one memorable case, a being who had survived first contact with 3 different hostile species and lived to complain about the paperwork. But here was the thing about the Intersystem Combat Academy that nobody put in the brochures. It was absolutely terrible at learning from its own mistakes. Every cycle, without fail, some hotshot from a high-gravity world would swagger into the training halls, flex whatever appendages their species used for flexing, and assume that their particular brand of biological superiority made them the apex predator of the station. And every cycle, without fail, reality would introduce itself with extreme prejudice. Today's lesson in humility was scheduled for 900 hours, Galactic Standard Time, in Training Hall 7. The hall itself was an impressive space, roughly the size of a small landing field, with walls that could project any environment the instructors desired. Currently, it displayed a simple grid pattern, the universal signal for, "We're about to watch someone get their assumptions rearranged." Approximately 60 cadets had gathered along the observation platforms, their various forms of excited chatter creating a polyglot symphony that the station's translators struggled to parse. At the center of this attention stood Kael'thor Vexenari, and if you had asked him to describe himself, he would have needed approximately 4 hours and a PowerPoint presentation, the Cliff Notes version. 7 feet of scaled muscle, 4 arms that could each bench press a small shuttle, and a family lineage that read like a greatest hits album of military achievement. His species, the Vraxians, hailed from a world where the gravity was roughly 3 times Earth standard, and the wildlife had evolved the charming habit of trying to kill you in increasingly creative ways. Kael'thor had the kind of face that suggested his ancestors had survived by headbutting their problems into submission, which wasn't far from the truth. His scales shifted through shades of deep crimson and black, a coloration that, according to Vraxian tradition, indicated a warrior bloodline. He wore the Academy's standard training uniform, modified to accommodate his extra arms, and he wore it the way a prize fighter wears championship belts, as a statement of fact rather than fashion. His credentials were, admittedly, impressive. Top marks in tactical theory, highest scores in the strength and endurance trials. Personal commendations from 3 separate instructors who used words like exceptional and formidable and please stop breaking the equipment. His simulation scores put him in the top 5% of the Academy's current roster, and he made sure everyone knew it with the subtlety of a supernova. But here was Kael'thor's fatal flaw. the crack in his otherwise impeccable armor. He had bought completely into the galaxy's conventional wisdom about Deathworlders. And like most conventional wisdom, it was about 50% fact, 40% exaggeration, and 10% pure fiction that someone had made up after too many drinks at a cantina. The galaxy classified worlds on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being aggressively hospitable, and 10 being actively trying to murder you at all times. Deathworlds clocked in at 9 or above. They were the places where evolution had looked at the concept of survivable conditions and decided that was for quitters. High gravity, extreme temperature variations, atmospheric compositions that could charitably be described as spicy, and ecosystems where everything, and I mean everything, had evolved to be either poisonous, venomous, or just really good at biting. Earth rated a solid 9.7 on the Deathworld scale, which put it in the "are you kidding me" category of planetary classifications. The gravity alone was enough to make most species uncomfortable. The fact that humans had evolved to not only survive, but thrive in those conditions should have been everyone's first clue that maybe, just maybe, they shouldn't be taken lightly. But conventional wisdom, as mentioned, was kind of an idiot. The prevailing theory among the galactic community was that Deathworld species were survivors rather than warriors. Tough, sure, in the way that cockroaches are tough. Good at not dying, absolutely. But actual combat capability? The kind of refined, trained lethality that places like the Intersystem Combat Academy cultivated? That required more than just stubbornness and a refusal to acknowledge when you should be dead. Or so the theory went. Riley Chen had arrived at the Academy 3 cycles ago, and her presence had generated exactly the kind of buzz you'd expect when you dropped a Deathworlder into a population that had spent their entire lives believing their own press releases. The other cadets had reacted with a mixture of curiosity, condescension, and in a few cases, genuine concern for her well-being. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall, which translated to adorably tiny, in a station where the average height was somewhere north of 6.5 feet. Her build was what humans called athletic, and what everyone else called, "Wait, where are all your muscles?" Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, dark brown and shot through with the kind of premature gray that suggested either stress or really unfortunate genetics. Her eyes were dark, alert, and contained a level of situational awareness that most people missed because they were too busy assuming she was fragile. The Academy's administration had placed her in standard housing, which meant a room designed for the average galactic citizen. The ceiling was too high, the bed was too long, and the gravity in her quarters was set to 0.8 standard because someone had assumed that anything higher would crush her. She had politely requested they turn it up to 1.2, which had earned her some confused looks and a maintenance ticket that took 2 weeks to process. Her performance in classes had been quietly competent. Not flashy, not attention-grabbing, just consistently solid. She aced the tactical theory courses because, as it turned out, humans had spent millennia perfecting the art of killing each other and had gotten pretty good at the theory part. Her marks in the technical courses were above average. The survival courses were almost comically easy for someone who came from a world where going outside was its own form of extreme sport. But it was the physical trials where things got interesting. The Academy used a standardized testing system that accounted for species differences, scaling scores based on what was theoretically possible for each cadet's biology. Riley's raw scores were middle of the pack, which was exactly what everyone expected. What they didn't realize was that the scaling system was calibrated wrong for humans, because the galaxy's database on human physiology was based on approximately 3 samples and a lot of guesswork. Humans, as it turned out, were walking contradictions wrapped in skin that was simultaneously too fragile and absurdly resilient. They had stamina that made no sense for a species of their size. Their reflexes operated on a time scale that suggested their nervous systems were running overclocked software. They could survive injuries that would kill most species and then complain about it afterward. And they had this absolutely unhinged ability to simply decide that pain was a suggestion rather than a hard limit. But none of that showed up in the standardized tests, so Riley remained comfortably under everyone's radar, which was exactly where she preferred to be. She trained quietly, studied diligently, and maintained the kind of low profile that would have made a spy proud. She made a few friends among the other cadets, mostly the ones who were less invested in the academy's social hierarchy and more interested in actually learning something. The instructors noticed, of course. Instructors always noticed. But they kept their observations to themselves, curious to see how long it would take for the rest of the academy to figure out what they already knew. It took 3 cycles. Not bad, all things considered. The revelation came during a routine announcement in the mess hall, when Instructor Veshik had posted the upcoming training schedules. Veshik was a Krithek, which meant she looked like someone had taken a praying mantis, scaled it up to human size, given it 4 eyes, and then taught it advanced combat theory. Her species communicated through a combination of clicking sounds and pheromone signals, which the station's translators rendered into clipped, no-nonsense sentences that matched her personality perfectly. The upcoming exercise was simple in concept, nightmarish in execution. Close-quarters combat assessment. No weapons, no armor, no fancy gadgets. Just you, your opponent, and a training circle where one of you would win and the other would learn a valuable lesson about their place in the universe. The Academy called these exercises practical application of theoretical knowledge, which was educational speak for sanctioned violence. The pairings were supposedly random, generated by an algorithm that accounted for weight class, experience level, and species compatibility. This was partially true. The algorithm was absolutely random. What the cadets didn't know was that Instructor Veshik had approximately 0 faith in random chance and regularly adjusted the pairings to create what she called learning opportunities. Today's learning opportunity had Kael'thor Vexnari paired against Riley Chen. And if you had been watching Veshik when she approved that particular pairing, you might have noticed what passed for a smile on a Krithek face. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of an instructor who had seen this exact scenario play out a dozen times and never got tired of the results. The mess hall's reaction was immediate and predictable. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Cadets looked at the pairing list, then at Riley, then at Kael'thor, then back at the list as if it might have changed in the intervening seconds. Someone laughed, then tried to disguise it as a cough. Someone else muttered something about medical teams on standby. Kael'thor's reaction was less predictable, mainly because he decided to turn it into performance art. He stood up from his table, all 7 feet and 4 arms of him, and performed what could only be described as a theatrical scan of the room until his eyes landed on Riley. Then he laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a dismissive snort, but a full, booming laugh that suggested he had just heard the funniest joke in the galaxy. "You are serious?" he called out, his voice carrying across the mess hall with the kind of projection that suggested he had missed his calling as an opera singer. "This is the pairing? The Academy pairs me against the Deathworld survivor?" Several cadets shifted uncomfortably. Riley continued eating her lunch with the kind of focus that suggested the most interesting thing in the universe was currently the structural integrity of her sandwich. Kael'thor wasn't done. "I have fought Krothgan wrestlers. I have trained with Zephyr commandos, And now I am expected to face someone whose species considers sharp stick a viable weapon? More laughter now, less uncomfortable. When the top-ranked cadet made a joke, people laughed. That was how social hierarchies worked, even among supposedly enlightened military cadets. Perhaps we should pad the training circle, Kael'thor continued, warming to his theme. I would hate to accidentally break the Deathworlder. Instructor Veshk, does the Academy's insurance cover this? Riley took another bite of her sandwich. She chewed thoroughly. She swallowed. Then she looked up at Kael'thor with an expression of such profound disinterest that it could have flash-frozen helium. You done? She asked. Kael'thor spread all four arms in a magnanimous gesture. I am merely concerned for your safety. Perhaps you would prefer to forfeit? There is no shame in recognizing when one is outmatched. Right, Riley said, turning back to her lunch. See you at 0900. The dismissal was so casual, so utterly unbothered, that it actually shut Kael'thor up for a solid 3 seconds. Then he laughed again, louder this time, and returned to his table where his friends clapped him on the back and contributed their own jokes about the upcoming mismatch. At the instructor's table, Veshik exchanged glances with her colleague, a Torvin named Kelesh, who looked like a bipedal bear that someone had carved from solid granite. Kelesh made a clicking sound that the translators rendered as, "How much are you betting?" "Nothing," Veshik replied. "This is not gambling. This is education." "How much?" 50 credits on under 30 seconds, 40 on under 20. They sealed the bet with a gesture that would have horrified the Academy's Ethics Committee, had anyone bothered to inform the Academy's Ethics Committee. Which nobody did, because the Ethics Committee was composed of people who had never been in an actual fight, and therefore had opinions that could be safely ignored. Training Hall 7 filled up well before 0900 hours. Word had spread through the station with the kind of velocity usually reserved for really good gossip or really bad cafeteria food. By the time Riley and Kael'thor entered the hall, nearly 200 cadets had found reasons to be in the vicinity, all of them suddenly fascinated by close-quarters combat theory. The training circle itself was a simple affair. A 10-meter diameter ring marked by force field projectors that would prevent anyone from accidentally getting thrown into the audience. The floor was covered in impact-absorbing material that could handle most forms of violence short of orbital bombardment. Above the circle, holographic displays showed various angles and readouts for the benefit of the observers and the instructors who were supposedly evaluating technique but were really just there to watch the show. Riley entered from the west entrance, wearing the standard training gear, flexible gray material that moved with the body, and could take a decent amount of punishment. She walked to her starting position with the kind of loose rolling gait that suggested her muscles knew exactly how to work together and didn't need her brain's permission to do so. Kael'thor entered from the east like he was arriving at his own coronation. He had opted for the sleeveless variant of the training gear, the better to display the kind of musculature that sculptors used as reference material. He cracked his knuckles, all 4 sets of them, creating a sound like a xylophone falling downstairs. The crowd appreciated the showmanship. Instructor Veshik stood at the edge of the circle, her 4 eyes tracking both competitors with a kind of attention that missed nothing. "Standard rules," she announced, her voice cutting through the ambient noise like a diamond-edged saw. "No strikes to sensory organs, no joint breaks, no techniques that would cause permanent damage. Victory is achieved through submission, incapacitation, or ring-out. The match ends when I declare it ended, and not 1 second before. Medical teams are standing by, though I suspect they will not be necessary." That last part was delivered while looking directly at Kael'thor, who seemed to miss the subtext entirely. "Fighters ready?" Riley nodded once, rolling her shoulders in a loose shrug that settled her center of gravity. Kael'thor dropped into a combat stance that was technically perfect and practically telegraphed exactly how he planned to attack. Begin. For exactly 1.3 seconds, nothing happened. Both fighters remained in their positions, apparently content to evaluate each other from a safe distance. This was normal. This was expected. This was the part where trained combatants assessed their opponent's stance, looked for weaknesses, and formulated strategy. Then Kael'thor attacked, because patience was for people who lacked confidence in their physical superiority. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, his primary right arm cocking back for a strike that had all the subtlety of a meteor impact. The plan, insofar as he had one, was simple. One solid hit to demonstrate the gulf in their capabilities, then a quick grapple to force submission. Clean, professional, and over in seconds. He would even help her up afterward and say something magnanimous about Deathworlders having heart, if not skill. The punch never landed. Riley moved. It wasn't a desperate dodge or a panicked scramble. It was a precise, economical shift that put her exactly where Kael'thor's fist wasn't. Her right hand came up, caught his extended wrist, and suddenly physics got involved in the conversation. She pivoted, her body rotating under his arm, and used his own momentum against him in a textbook demonstration of leverage over strength. Kael'thor, all 7 feet and 4 arms of him, found himself suddenly airborne. His brain, still trying to process how he had missed, was now forced to deal with the more immediate problem of why the ceiling was getting closer, and why his inner ear was screaming obscenities in his species' native language. He hit the mat with a sound like a bag of hammers being dropped from orbit. The impact-absorbing floor did its job, which meant Kael'thor wasn't seriously injured. What it couldn't absorb was his dignity, which shattered on contact and scattered in about 8 different directions. Riley hadn't let go of his wrist. As he hit, she transitioned smoothly into an arm lock. Her weight positioned precisely to keep him pinned, while his brain rebooted from the unexpected flight experience. Her other hand was already positioned near his neck, not touching, just hovering in a position that suggested she knew exactly where all the important blood vessels were located. The training hall was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. In space, through a vacuum, with acoustic dampeners active. Instructor Veshik checked her chronometer, 4.7 seconds. She made a clicking sound that the translators wisely declined to render into any known language. "Mercy?" Riley asked, her voice perfectly calm, like she was asking if Kael'thor wanted sugar in his tea. Kael'thor's response was a strangled sound that came from somewhere between his throat and his pride. He tried to move, discovered that physics had several opinions about that plan, and reluctantly tapped the mat twice with his free hand. Riley released him immediately and stood up, offering her hand to help him up. The gesture was so casually polite that it somehow made the whole thing worse. Kael'thor stared at her hand like it was a particularly insulting alien artifact, then hauled himself to his feet without assistance. "Lucky," he managed, his voice rough. "You caught me off guard." The narrator would like to pause here to point out that Lucky was doing more work in that sentence than a cargo hauler during festival season. What had actually happened was a demonstration of the fundamental principle that training and technique could absolutely humble raw strength when applied correctly. But Kael'thor's brain, currently scrambling to protect his ego from complete collapse, had decided that acknowledging reality was optional. Riley just shrugged. "Sure." "Again," Kael'thor demanded, turning to Instructor Veshik. "I demand a rematch." Veshik's compound eyes glittered with what might have been amusement if Krithek experienced amusement in ways that other species recognized. "The rules permit 3 rounds per match," she agreed. If both fighters consent. Riley looked at Kael'thor, then at Veshik, then back at Kael'thor. Okay, she said, with the same tone someone might use to agree to doing the dishes. Round 2 began with Kael'thor adopting a different strategy, which mainly consisted of try the same thing, but angrier. He came in fast, all 4 arms working in concert now, attempting to overwhelm Riley through sheer volume of attacks. It was actually a solid tactical choice, the kind of thing they taught in advanced combat courses. When facing a technically superior opponent, increase the tempo until they make a mistake. Riley made exactly 0 mistakes. She flowed around his attacks like water finding paths around rocks. Her movements economical to the point of being almost lazy. A slight turn put his first punch into empty air. A duck let his second sail overhead. A step to the left made his third miss by centimeters. And when his 4th arm came in for what he thought was a surprise attack from his off angle, she caught it, redirected it, and used it as an anchor point to spin inside his guard. What followed was a brief but educational demonstration in the practical applications of joint manipulation. Riley's elbow found Kael'thor's ribs with the kind of precision that suggested she knew exactly where all his organs were and which ones it was safe to hit. The strike wasn't hard enough to cause serious damage, but it was definitely hard enough to make Kael'thor's body reconsider some of its recent life choices. He stumbled back, more surprised than hurt, and she was already there, her legs sweeping his feet out from under him in a move that would have made any martial arts instructor weep with pride. For the second time in as many minutes, Kael'thor went down. This time with Riley's knee pressing into his back and her hands controlling both his primary arms in a lock that was probably causing all sorts of interesting sensations in his shoulder joints. "Mercy?" she asked again. And honestly, the fact that she had to ask twice was just adding insult to injury at this point. Kael'thor tapped out, faster this time, his pride having learned that resistance just made things hurt more. Riley released him and stood up, not even breathing hard, which was maybe the most insulting part of the whole exchange. The training hall remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a dawning realization that was spreading through the crowd like a very slow, very embarrassing virus. The cadets were beginning to understand that their assumptions about Deathworlders, about humans specifically, might need some revision. At the instructor's platform, Veshik made another clicking sound and held out her hand to Kael'thor, who grudgingly transferred 50 credits with the air of someone who had known this was coming, but had hoped to be wrong. Kael'thor stood there in the center of the ring, his chest heaving from exertion and possibly some other emotions that he wasn't quite ready to name yet. His scales had darkened from crimson to a deeper shade that suggested either rage or profound embarrassment, or possibly both. He looked at Riley, then at the floor, then at the crowd of cadets who were very carefully not making eye contact with him. "One more round," he said quietly. Riley tilted her head slightly. "You sure?" "Please," Kael'thor added. And that single word cost him more than the previous 2 defeats combined. Instructor Veshik considered this. On one hand, she had made her point, and continuing seemed potentially cruel. On the other hand, this was exactly the kind of educational moment that the Academy existed to provide. "One final round," she agreed. "Begin when ready." This time, Kael'thor didn't charge. He approached carefully, his stance more defensive, his movements more controlled. He had finally started using his brain instead of just his muscles, which was progress even if it had taken 2 defeats to get there. He feinted with his upper right arm, watching Riley's response, trying to learn her patterns. Riley didn't bite on the feint. She shifted her weight slightly, adjusting her stance. And Kael'thor realized with a sinking feeling that she had been holding back. Not dramatically, not insultingly, but enough. She hadn't been fighting at full capacity because she hadn't needed to. They circled each other, and for approximately 15 seconds, it actually looked like a competitive match. Kael'thor tested her defenses. She responded appropriately, and observers who didn't know any better might have thought this was an even contest between skilled fighters. Then Kael'thor committed to an attack, a fast combination that would have overwhelmed most opponents, and Riley slipped inside his guard like she had been invited. Her palm struck his sternum, not with enough force to damage, but with enough precision to knock the wind out of his lungs and disrupt his balance. As he stumbled, she hooked his leg, controlled his arm, and took him down one final time with a throw that was so technically perfect it should have been used in instructional videos. She didn't bother with a submission hold this time. She just stood over him, waiting, and after a long moment, Kael'thor tapped the mat without prompting. Match concluded, Instructor Veshik announced. Winner, Chen. The training hall erupted in a combination of applause, incredulous laughter, and the kind of animated discussion that happens when people's worldviews get thoroughly rearranged. Riley helped Kael'thor up, and this time he took her hand, pulling himself to his feet with as much dignity as he could, salvage from the wreckage of his ego. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your species. You are not warriors." Riley smiled. And it wasn't a mean smile or a gloating smile, just the smile of someone who had heard this particular misconception approximately 8,000 times. "My species spent 300,000 years living on a planet that was actively trying to kill us," she said. "We learned to fight everything, including each other, especially each other, actually. We got really good at it. But the strength difference matters less than you think." Riley interrupted gently. "You're stronger than me, yeah. But I'm faster, more flexible, and I grew up in gravity that would crush you. My bones are denser than yours. My muscles can operate in conditions that would put you in a medical pod. And every single day of my life, I've been fighting against a planet that didn't care if I survived. You trained for combat. I was born into it." She paused, considering her words carefully. "Also, you telegraph your attacks like you're announcing them over the station intercom. Might want to work on that." Somewhere in the crowd, someone laughed. And then someone else joined in, and within seconds, the entire hall was filled with the kind of laughter that comes from tension release rather than actual humor. Kael'thor stood there, processing this information, his worldview undergoing some necessary renovations. The medical team did a quick scan and confirmed what everyone already knew. Kael'thor had sustained no serious injuries beyond catastrophic damage to his pride, which wasn't covered under the Academy's medical protocols. Riley checked out fine, because of course she did. Instructor Veshik dismissed the crowd, though many cadets lingered, suddenly very interested in asking Riley questions about human combat techniques. Kael'thor sat on a bench at the edge of the training hall, watching Riley demonstrate a basic joint lock to a group of fascinated cadets. One of his friends, a Zephyr named Tixal, sat down beside him, her wings folded in a gesture of sympathy. "That was educational," Tixal offered. "That was humiliating," Kael'thor corrected. "That was both," Tixal agreed. "The Academy specializes in humiliating education, builds character." She paused. "Also, for what it's worth, you're not the first person to make assumptions about Deathworlders. 3 cycles ago, there was a Krathan who learned this same lesson. Before that, a Torvek. And before that, I understand the pattern," Kael'thor interrupted. The Academy pairs overconfident warriors against underestimated Deathworlders to teach us humility. Not just humility, Tixall said. Perspective. You can't be a good soldier if you only know how to fight people weaker than you. The galaxy is full of species who don't fit our assumptions. Better to learn that here than in actual combat. Kael'thor watched Riley execute another demonstration, her movements precise and controlled. She could have hurt me badly, he realized. All 3 rounds, she was holding back enough to make it a lesson instead of an injury. Now you're learning, Tixall said, standing up. Come on. You're buying drinks at the cantina, and then you're apologizing to her properly. Not the mess hall performance art apology, the real one. I do not owe her, Kael'thor started, then stopped when Tixall gave him a look that suggested his learning experience might continue if he finished that sentence. I will buy drinks, he amended. 1 week later, Training Hall 7 hosted another close-quarters combat session, and the dynamic had shifted in subtle but important ways. Riley still trained quietly, still maintained her low profile. But now other cadets occasionally asked her for advice or requested practice matches. She agreed when she had time, always careful to teach rather than dominate. And the Academy's overall combat skill level began a slow but measurable improvement. Kael'thor, for his part, had undergone something approximating personal growth. He still ranked near the top of the class, but his approach to training had lost some of its swagger and gained something more valuable: consideration. He practiced defensive techniques. He studied species biology with actual interest rather than academic obligation. And twice a week, he trained with Riley, learning to adapt his strength to work with technique rather than instead of it. Instructor Veshik watched this development with the satisfaction of an educator whose lesson plan had worked exactly as intended. She made a note in her records that this year's crop of cadets was progressing adequately, which was her equivalent of glowing praise. The galaxy, as mentioned before, was absolutely terrible at learning from its mistakes. Somewhere out there, on another station or another academy or another military installation, some other overconfident warrior from some other high-gravity world was currently making assumptions about some other Deathworlder. The galaxy's conventional wisdom remained stubbornly conventional, resistant to updates, confident in its outdated databases and anecdotal evidence. This was fine. This was, in fact, exactly how it was supposed to work. Because every generation needed to learn these lessons fresh, needed to have their assumptions challenged, needed to discover that strength came in forms they hadn't anticipated, and that the universe was far stranger and more interesting than their comfortable worldview suggested. And so the cycle continued, as it always had, as it probably always would. Deathworlders arrived at the Academy, underestimated and overlooked, carrying with them the accumulated evolutionary wisdom of planets that had spent billions of years perfecting the art of creating survivors. And every cycle, without fail, someone learned the hard way that survival was its own form of combat training. The Intersystem Combat Academy existed to train the galaxy's finest warriors. But its more important function, the one they didn't put in the brochures, was teaching those warriors that finest was a category with far more competitors than they initially assumed. Riley Chen continued her education, passed her courses, and eventually graduated with honors. She went on to have a long and distinguished career. But that's a different story. This story ends here, in Training Hall 7, with a lesson learned and a warrior humbled, and the eternal, unchanging truth that the galaxy's capacity for overconfidence was matched only by its capacity for surprise. And somewhere, right now, another alien was making the same mistake. The galaxy turned, indifferent and vast. And the cycle continued. After all, some lessons needed to be learned personally,